Okay, so we're continuing on with our lecture on the animal kingdom. And hopefully, what you've noticed by now is that compared to the other groups I've talked about, animals have a lot more diversity and differentiation. And if we go way, way, way back, let me just flip, flip, flip. If we remember here, we're looking at some of these major deviations into new characteristics on the animal evolutionary tree. We've gone through sponges and cnidarians, which are our early animals, and sponges are kind of an outgroup. Cnidarians are our radial animals. And then we've gotten into bilateral animals, having those left and right halves. And you have your protostomes, which we just went through in the flatworms, mollusks, annelids, and arthropods. And then we have deuterostomes. So here's where we see this differentiation in the developmental process of the embryo, where the first hole that forms in the developing embryo becomes the anus rather than the mouth. So we're going to talk about our two phyla of deuterostomes. The first is echinoderms or echinoderms, echinodermata. These are your groups. Echino means spine and derm means skin. So this group is literally your spiny skinned animals. And this is a really kind of weird group because what they've done is they've lost some evolutionary traits and they've kind of gone backwards from what we see in our evolutionary development of more complex organisms. These are actually really simple animals once they are as adults. So as juveniles, they are bilaterally symmetrical, which is why we are classifying them as a bilateral animal. However, as adults, they are pentaradial. So these are your sea stars, your sand dollars, your sea urchins, and you can divide them like a star, right? You can divide them into halves in a circular manner, but only in some ways. It's not like your anemones where it's true radial symmetry, okay? These are all marine animals. There are no terrestrial or freshwater echinoderms. They are all marine because they actually have a unique system called the water vascular system. So what they actually do is they pull in seawater into their bodies through something called a sieve plate or madreporite, and that allows them to circulate that water through their body and then remove it. So they don't have any complex respiratory, excretory, or circulatory systems. That water vascular system makes up all of the other things. They do gas exchange through diffusion. They don't have blood. They use their water, and that water is used as a hydrostatic skeleton, as a movement, as a way of removing waste. They are a very odd group. Recent study as of I think 2023 or 2024 suggests that these animals are actually just ahead, so they've kind of lost the rest of those characteristics. They're a weird group. Now, they do have tube feet for movement. That is something that we find in all of them. And if you remember Finding Nemo or watching any other sea star, they have those little suckers on the bottom of their arms. Those are called tube feet. Those are controlled by the water pushing into and out of them. So as soon as we take these guys out of water, they start to dehydrate. They can no longer move. They can no longer breathe. They can no longer remove waste. They don't have any sort of circulatory system. Their skeleton deflates. And so if you ever see a sea star on land, there is a video out there of someone watching a sea star on land, and it's just slowly losing its fluid over time. If you find one and it's still moving, just put it back in the water, okay? Sea stars are able to regenerate any lost limbs, kind of like your planarias, but that's not true for all of these group. If you see your sea urchins or your sand dollars, their internal skeleton, they have a internal shell that's called, it's like a skeleton. It's made of calcium carbonate. So it's an endoskeleton in that same way with the hydrostatic skeleton. They have a little bit of both. If you break that, you've destroyed that animal. You've broken that animal open. But sea stars, because their arms are not connected to the main part of that skeleton, what's called a central ring, they can develop those back. And that's a main defense of brittle stars. Brittle stars are called that because if you move them and they are stressed or they feel threatened, they will just drop their arms and grow a new one. So Very similar to what we see in our lizards with their tails. So we do see some regeneration here, and sometimes it could form a whole new animal depending on where that breaks, but not every group, not every class of animal within this phyla. Okay, a really weird group, super cool. We absolutely see sea urchins and sand dollars along the coast here. I found the endoskeleton of both, and we call them like the shell or the test of both of those guys. So very cool group. Now to the group we all know best. Okay, our group that we all know best are the chordates. If you were to list animals, if you were to sit down and say, let me just list all the animals that I can think of, I guarantee that about 90% of those animals would have fallen within this particular phyla. This phyla used to be known as vertebrata. But we do have some individuals within this group that are not vertebrates. They're invertebrates. They don't have a skeleton. The majority of animals within here do have a skeleton, but the classification of something as a chordate is dependent on its embryological development. So at a certain point in time, all chordates have a notochord, a dorsal hollow or dorsal tubular nerve cord, pharyngeal pouches or pharyngeal gills or pharyngeal slits, you'll see them called different things, and a postanal tail. So it doesn't matter if we're looking at a fish or a bird or a reptile, a tortoise, a snake, a mouse, or a human. All of these organisms are chordates because they all have these particular traits. So we know there is an evolutionary relationship here because those traits are shared. They're homologous to this particular group. And at a certain point in development, they all look very similar. We don't have a whole lot of differentiation until we get to a higher level of development of that embryo. What's really cool is your notochord actually becomes your spinal cord and brain, and the dorsal tubular nerve cord encases that in bones. That becomes your vertebra and your cranium. Your pharyngeal pouches become part of your inner ear, your jaw, your heart, your lungs, and the postanal tail is lost in some animals, but it would be retained in like your cats and dogs, right? Their tail is beyond where the anus opening is, and so it's considered a postanal tail. When we look at evolution among the chordates, we have some other very major steps that allowed for the diversification of this group. So in here, we have our outgroups in our invertebrate chordates, and then we have the vertebrates, and then within the vertebrates, we have tetrapods, and tetrapods are the group that we see moving onto land and being able to handle that drying, harsh environment with the gravity and gas exchange and water exchange. So we'll talk about what allows these tetrapods to live on land. We're going to run through each of these groups a little bit. And again, I want you to know the major classifications here. So I want you to know the difference between, amphibians, reptiles, mammals, and fish. But I think it's really fascinating to talk about the invertebrate ones, the ones that are kind of the weird group, because they were misclassified for a very long time. So we have two groups of invertebrate chordates. The first group is your tunicates or sea squirts. Tunicates are really kind of cool. They are often going to grow through asexual reproduction and then sexual reproduction at some point in their life. The larvae are bilaterally symmetrical and have the four chordate characteristics, but the adults don't. The adults are sessile and they seem very similar to sponges, but they don't have the characteristic cells we see in sponges. And so we actually had tunicates classified in two different groups as juveniles and adults because for a long time we didn't know that the juveniles were the larval stage of the adult sessile form. What ended up happening is they were being held, the juveniles, the larval stage was being held in a lab for a while, and they ended up metamorphosizing into the adult tunicates. And that was when the scientists who were studying went, hold on, we have these animals classified wrong completely. They're very similar to sponges in how they act. They do actually do filter feeding. They pull water into one of the intake valves and then they push it through their bodies. They have sticky cells that capture the food. They're often found in the same places as sponges. And so for a long time, they kind of defied some of our classification aspects. The other group of invertebrate chordates we did know was a chordate because they do have the chordate characteristics. These are your lancelets. They are very much going to have those characteristics even as adults. So what's really cool is you can almost see it in this image here. There is like thin lines on the back. One of those thin lines would be the notochord. One would be the dorsal hollow nerve cord. They do have those pharyngeal slits that you can see in the body of the animal itself. It's kind of up towards this mouth. There's going to be these pharyngeal slits. If we had a good microscope slide, you'd be able to visualize those, but they look like little gills when you are able to see it clearly. And then the anus is at the end, but the tail extends beyond that. And so when we talk about our invertebrate chordates, this group is what we would consider the sister group. So the lancelets are the ones that are most closely related to our vertebrate chordates, and then the tunicates are what we would consider an outgroup in that case, if we're looking at classifications here. So once we have an idea of these, just again, they're just kind of a fun group. I think we have to give credit where it's due. We have to talk about them because they gave rise, or they're ancestrally relevant to our understanding of chordates. We then move into the group that does have vertebra. And so this would be the groups that are classified as vertebrata. And this includes a couple of different classes. Okay, so phylum vertebrata, classes would be within that. Our first class are our jawless fish, also known as agnatha or anatha. Natha refers to the jaw, and a means without. These are your hagfish and your lamprey. Um, I love these guys. They're so weird. These are often some deep sea animals, but we can find them in other environments. But they are aquatic. They are a kind of fish. Okay. On this image to the left here is a hagfish. Hagfish are deep sea dwellers. They're scavengers. They're decomposers. They don't have scales. They have like a smooth skin, and they are often fished for food as a delicacy. In addition, their skin is used as a replacement for like eel skin wallets or eel skin boots. They don't have jaws. They usually have suction or rasping mouths that are going to allow them to get into their food source. Hagfish and lamprey both kind of chew into a food source. The hagfish themselves are absolutely fascinating. So adult hagfish have this defense mechanism, which is to produce a slime. The slime is incredibly dense and thick. It can stop a bullet. It's stronger than ballistics gel in a lot of cases, and it will get into, so if a fish bites a hagfish, like a shark bites a hagfish, that hagfish releases the slime. When the slime is encountered to that seawater, it has this chemical reaction that becomes this thick, viscous mucus that actually ends up sticking into the gills of whatever that fish was that bit it. A lot of times it does result in the death of that predator, because if your gills don't work, you can't breathe. People do collect hagfish. They are cultivated, they are kept, and one of the things that's like one of my favorite news clips, I have a picture of a Prius. And this Prius has hagfish in it, on it, all over, and the slime. What ended up happening here is there was a large truck that was transporting tanks of hagfish. And hagfish, when they are startled or when they are in any sort of situation they're not feeling safe, they will produce the slime as a defense. That is the innate behavior. They just do it. The truck tipped over onto a road, and I believe this is in Oregon somewhere, and it fell onto this Prius and onto the highway. There's a video clip out there, and they are scraping the road with a bulldozer because you cannot get the slime off. They have fire hoses. They're doing their best. This car is absolutely totaled. That slime, that white mucus that you see all over this car is that thick hagfish slime. I feel bad for the people, but it was like such a fun, it's a really interesting video if you're curious about it. And then we have our lamprey. Lamprey are parasites. They have a toothed oral disc with a rasping tongue inside. They are going to have an anticoagulant in their saliva, and they actually do chew into fish. At the bottom image here, I have an image of a rainbow trout that has these large circular wounds on it right behind the gill. That is where lamprey like to attach to their prey. They will rasp away, chew away some of that skin, and then they just take in the blood and fluids as a nutrient source. Lamprey are a common parasite in oceans and things, but because we dug a canal from the Atlantic Ocean into the Great Lakes. Lamprey from the ocean, Atlantic lamprey, were able to move into the Great Lakes and have moved through that Great Lakes system. They can handle being in fresh water, and they are actually a hugely problematic invasive species because while they don't generally kill the host directly, having a large open wound in an aquatic environment isn't super great to surviving. And so lamprey are a species of interest in trying to go through and remove them. It's very, very difficult because they lay millions of eggs. One of my favorite, I love I love any nature shows, and there's a show with called River Monsters with Jeremy Wade. There is an episode about lamprey and what they're doing to control them, which is fascinating. But he allows a lamprey to grab onto his skin, which is the dumbest thing I've ever seen a biologist do in a nature documentary. Because your skin on your neck is very, very thin and very, very sensitive, and you have large veins and arteries that are close to where he put this thing. He should have put it on his arm or his leg, and he was like, "Oh, that really hurts. Oh, that really hurts," and they couldn't get it off because as soon as they get onto flesh, they just start that suction, that oral disc suctions to the prey, and then they start chewing into that prey. So it's such a great episode though, so go like YouTube it. Okay. Cool. After our jawless fish, we do start to see the development and evolution of jaws. Jaws become a huge game changer in what you can consume. So having these well-developed senses, having these skeletons of cartilage, and having this jaw protrusion allowed our cartilaginous fishes, your chondrichthyes, to become a very dominant group of organisms in oceans and then also moving into freshwater environments. These are your sharks, skates, and rays. If you haven't been on the coast here in North Carolina, we have a lot of sharks. People are like, shark-infested waters. Just water, okay? Sharks live in the ocean. We do have a lot of shark teeth that can be found, as well as ray teeth and ray barbs. Absolutely cool. They're not there to hurt you, okay? Shark, skates, and rays are just a normal animal in the oceans. They are top predators in a lot of cases because they have these characteristics that allowed them to become very good at feeding. But if you ever watch sharks feeding on like a whale, like a dead whale, they bite and then they usually have to twist and turn. They can't chew their food. They have to bite off chunks and then swallow it whole. So if they get too big of a chunk, they can't swallow it whole. The same thing with rays and skates. They are going to kind of have a protrusible jaw that allows them to suction in food. Rays and skates often eat hard animals like your crustaceans, so your crabs, those invertebrate arthropods in the oceans. So they have grinding jaws, which is really kind of neat. This entire group has a really, really well-developed senses, especially in the electromagnetic spectrum. They can detect electrical currents in the water. They actually do have good vision. People always say sharks have bad vision. Not really. They just rely on other senses more. If you look up from the bottom of the water though, and you're on a surfboard, you do look like a seal. Like, okay, that's fair. The largest sharks in the world are actually not even predators of other animals in the same sense. Your basking shark and your whale shark are filter feeders, and they eat krill, which are small crustaceans, again, shrimp-like animals. These guys are cool because they do have separate sexes and they do have internal fertilization. So sharks and rays and skates all have internal fertilization, and their eggs are laid in egg cases, or sometimes the pups are retained internally, and then they are produced in a ovoviviparous or egg-laying live birth. So the eggs are retained internally and then the babies are born alive. This is a fun group. If you haven't gone looking for shark teeth, you should. North Carolina beaches are the best for looking for shark teeth and even like megalodon teeth. I personally haven't gotten lucky with meg teeth, but I have found some very large great white shark teeth, some fossilized ones. So, go have a look. Like, enjoy the beach and look for some things. Our largest group of vertebrates are your osteichthyes, or your bony fishes. So this is where insects are the largest group of our invertebrates. Your bony fish are the largest group of vertebrates as far as classification goes, as far as the number of representative species within that class. This includes your lionfish and your other like fin fishes, your ray-finned fishes, and then it also includes a couple small group of lobe-finned fishes. So when we talk about fish, fish. They actually have a huge array of what they can do. They do have separate sexes, but some fish change sexes. So things like clownfish, the largest individual becomes the female, and any small individuals are the males. If the female is removed, the next largest individual becomes the female. So in Finding Nemo, Marlin would have become a female and Nemo would have been the male. Just throwing that out there. Okay. They often have internal or external fertilization. It really depends on the particular species. Salmon, for instance, have that external fertilization, but things like guppies have internal fertilization. So we do see a lot of variation there. Marine and freshwater. Actually, we think that freshwater is where these osteichthyes, these bony fishes began, and then they moved back into marine environments. And they have the bony skeletons that allows them to maintain calcium and phosphorus, as well as have larger muscle attachment. So some of our fastest moving fish in our groups are in your osteichthyes, not in your chondrichthyes. Tuna, for instance, are some of the fastest moving fish, and they can have a lot of muscle attachment to those heavy bones. I meant to mention with the cartilaginous fishes, when they talk about skeletons of cartilage, they're still very hard cartilage. It's like the cartilage in the bridge of your nose, where it's hard, and if you break your nose, that's really what you break. So it is still allowing for a lot of muscle attachment, but it's not quite the same as what we see in the bony fish. Our lobe-finned fish are really cool. So this fish at the bottom here is called a lungfish. And there are 6 species of lungfish, 2 in Africa and 4 in Australia. And then there are, I think, maybe 3 now. If the current reports are accurate, but there are for sure 2 species of coelacanths that are lobe-finned fish. Not a really diverse group, really an ancient group that's gone mostly extinct at this point. But we do think that lobe-finned fishes are the ones that gave rise to our next class of vertebrates, the amphibians, because lobe-finned fishes have these fleshy fins that are able to then move on land effectively. So your lungfishes are called lungfishes because they can actually live out of water for a period of time. Some of them can move across land. So think about Africa, right? You have these droughts followed by rains. So you have these water holes that are drying up. Sometimes these fish can move from one water hole to another, or they will dig down into the muck and form a mucus-like cocoon around themselves and can survive for about 9 months out of a body of water in that case. So they're like an odd group in that way, but we do think that they share a common ancestry with the amphibians. Not that the current lungfish gave rise to amphibians, but rather that there is a common ancestry that is closer to the lobe-finned fish than what we see to the ray-finned fish. Again, really well-developed senses in this group. Very, very unique feeding methods. You have, your filter feeders, your opportunists, your carnivores, your detritivores. You have things like your archer fish that will spit water and knock fruits and bugs and things into the water for them to consume. You have your predatory fish like your tuna, and your swordfish, your sailfins that are really fast-moving fish. You have your sit-and-wait predators. This includes your eels. So you have your electric eels. You have your moray eels that have their second protrusible jaw. Like just a huge diversity within this classification of organisms. And if you've ever seen a fish tank or gone to the fish store, you know that the species we have are just outnumbering anything else. Okay? Our first group of tetrapods. So this is where things get interesting, okay? While the lobe-finned fish can live for potentially a little while out of land, this group is adapted to living in a terrestrial environment. Now, we have to rely on wet environments for amphibians, which is your frogs and toads, salamanders, and a group called caecilians. These particular groups do require moist, damp, aquatic environments. They are tied to the water still in how they lay their eggs. But this group has developed ways to move on land effectively. A lot of them have lungs that are developed, so your frogs do have lungs, and that does allow these organisms to live in a different environment than the juveniles. So we see a lot of metamorphosis in this group as well that is allowing for that differentiation of use of habitats by the adults and the juveniles. So we do have sexual reproduction here. They have separate sexes with external fertilization. External fertilization in your amphibians is often a male will sit on top of a female, especially in frogs, and wait for that female to lay her eggs. As she lays her eggs, he fertilizes them. So when you see those cute frogs hugging, right? The frog, the little tree frogs, there's one on top of the other. The smaller one on top is a male, and that is a process called amplexus, where the male is waiting for the female to lay the eggs. Sorry, okay? Um, we do find some of these guys that live in terrestrial environments their whole lives, and they're going to be like the poison dart frogs. They live in the rainforest. They're not necessarily laying their eggs in big ponds of water. They can lay their eggs in a small amount of water, and it's still effective. We have your Sicilians. They actually lay their eggs in really damp soil, but it's still very wet environments. And then things like your newts. This also includes your group of axolotls, where the adults are aquatic. As adults, they retain juvenile characteristics in those gills. A lot of juvenile of these guys have gills, and then they will develop lungs as they get older. The tails of your frogs go through apoptosis, so this little tadpole down here that's developing his legs, his tail is going through apoptosis. His body is reabsorbing those nutrients and using those to grow the legs, which will allow this animal to walk on land and still swim effectively because a lot of them have webbed toes. They do have very thin skin, and they are going to do a lot of gas exchange through their skin. So like our earthworms, they do still need to be very damp. If you find a dried out frog or a dried out toad, someone who hasn't been in water long enough, they will start to die. They're going to dehydrate and they will start to die. They have eyelids, they have ears, they have a sound producing larynx. So we know that this group very early moved into land and then stayed in land, but stayed very close to water environments. They have that skeleton to support their weight. They have limbs. The Sicilians have lost their limbs, but they do have limbs. And if you really want to research a weird animal, go look into Sicilians a little bit more. They are predatory. They do have teeth. And there are some Sicilian species where the female will allow her offspring to chew on her skin as a nutrient source and then will regrow her skin. It's absolutely insane. Bizarre animal right there. But yeah, we're most of us have seen the tree frogs hanging out. You know that frogs lay their eggs in water. We're familiar with amphibians in that case. Okay? After amphibians, we start seeing a group that is very well adapted to dry and wet environments and all sorts of environments. These are your reptiles. Class Reptilia includes turtles, snakes, lizards, crocodilians, and birds. So birds are reptiles, and birds share a common ancestry. They did descend from dinosaurs. We're going to talk about birds in a second here. But what makes this group really well adapted to living in dry environments, including deserts? We see a lot of reptiles in desert environments, is that they have internal fertilization and the development of something called an amniotic egg. So when we lay our eggs on land, they have to be protected from drying out. If your embryo dries out, your baby does not develop and does not survive. The amniotic egg is a self-contained pond. So think about a chicken egg. That shell is keeping the inside of the chicken egg wet, which is allowing that offspring to develop effectively through that kind of birth process, right? The embryo develops inside of the egg. Another thing that allows this group to live really well on land is they have scaly skin that prevents water loss. But then that means that they have to have a better way to breathe, because your amphibians do a lot of gas exchange through their skin and your reptiles don't. And so we see really well developed lungs here, along with a rib cage that allows them to get really good full breaths. When frogs breathe, they actually have to push the air into their lungs, but reptiles, like humans and other mammals, actually have a breathing in a negative sense where you kind of push the air out and then your body pulls the air back in. You don't have to physically push the air into your lungs. Frogs have to swallow and push the air into their lungs. We do see some of these groups losing limbs, but a lot of the limbs in these animals have moved underneath their bodies at a more of a 90-degree angle, which allows them to walk more effectively than our frogs, which tend to do more crawling or hopping. Think about the Komodo dragon. It still moves side to side, but it can move much quicker and much more effectively. Sea turtles are included in this, and sea turtles are a group that have moved back into the water. And so that's why sea turtles have to come on land to lay their eggs. If they lay their eggs in water, the eggs will drown because the eggs are adapted to being on land and handling that dry environment. So, what does the amniotic egg look like and why is it so keen? Also, if you don't like to look at reptiles, like they're so pretty. They have so many pretty colors. They have so many cool, unique adaptations and variations. The crocodilian, is not just alligators and crocodiles. There are so many different crocodile groups out there. I strongly suggest going and watching any nature documentary on reptiles. They're fascinating. The amniotic egg itself, though, is huge because it provides the developing embryo with oxygen, food, and water, and it removes the nitrogenous waste. It protects the embryo from the elements. So some of these guys will lay their eggs and leave them. You have that with some snakes and like the sea turtles. They lay their eggs and they go back into the water. You have some that are protective. So crocodilians, for instance, are very protective of their eggs. Alligators, crocodiles, caimans, gharials, the whole thing, and they're going to be raising their young for a while. So what does the amniotic egg look like? Well, when you think of the shell of an egg, like a chicken egg, it's a hard shell. It's not always, hard, but it is going to be a covering that is going to allow for that environment to be separate from the outside world. The embryo is going to be attached to a yolk sac, which is the food source, and then there's something around it called the allantois. So if you crack an egg, you're going to see the yolk, and then you're going to see a white around the yolk, and then the white itself. That kind of clear white around the yolk is the allantois. That is going to be a lot of cushion protection as well as allowing for gas exchange without being close to the shell itself. Then you have the chorion, which which is your white. If you've ever had a hard-boiled egg too, and you kind of peel it and you have that layer in there, that is going to be part of the chorion as well. Then you have that shell. You can imagine that this is going to be allowing this animal to live very effectively and develop effectively, and it allows for these animals to live in really dry environments like deserts and not have to worry about their offspring developing, so they're not tied to water anymore. Okay, how do we know that birds are reptiles? Okay, well, birds are reptiles because they share traits in common with reptiles. And honestly, Jurassic Park had a big role in this because Jurassic Park created this huge interest and boom in dinosaurs and paleontology. And so research has shown more and more and more that dinosaurs had feathers for thermal regulation, and then feathers became used for flight later. So feathers are modified reptilian scales. They are made of the same materials, and if you look at, like, here's a good picture of a snake's scales and here's a bird's feathers, they are the same shape. Okay, we get a lot of variation in coloration even within our reptile group. You have these blue lizards, you have these green snakes, you have these turtles with various colors. Like, you have a lot of variation there. And then we see, like, the beak is not that different, but the beak has been modified to allow for flight by being lighter. We still have the ear hole opening. This is a bird called a Watson. Watsons actually have claws on their front limbs as juveniles to allow them to move effectively in the trees. And so, you have this kind of claw that's very similar to the reptiles. Their feet are very similar to the reptiles. They still have scaled legs. Their tail vertebra are similar or the same. Their eyes are very similar. And so we know that the features of birds have changed and are modified for flight, but they share a common ancestry with other reptilians, and so birds are reptiles. Their forelimbs have been hollowed out. They have wings that have been modified. They have air sacs for respiration, but we do see them as a reptilian group as classification is concerned. One of the other things that I think is really interesting is this idea that feathers originally arose as a way of thermal regulation, as a way of maintaining internal body temperature. Your reptiles are ectotherms, except for birds who are endotherms. Ectotherms rely on external temperatures in order to do those things. So you'll see the snakes that are warming up and they're groggy and they're not moving, or those little anole lizards. You can catch them very easy and it's cold in the morning. But as soon as they warm up in your hand, they're ready to go. Birds maintain an internal temperature, and part of the reason for that was the development of feathers. Those feathers then secondarily became characteristics for flight because birds were chasing flying insects. So there is a big thought that birds were feathered, reptiles that were feathered, dinosaurs that were feathered, were able to more effectively catch the flying insects. And obviously, if you are better at doing something and that trait can be passed to offspring, that can lead to evolution. And so we see these modifications stacking up and accumulating in our birds. But yeah, birds are reptiles. Also, Watson's 10 out of 10. Strong recommend. Go check these birds out. They are really, really weird. They're a very old group of birds. They're very ancestral. They look like dinosaurs, and that's one of the things that we use as a homologous trait. Remember, we're looking at homologies here, those anatomical features that are similar. You're probably wondering, Miss Larson, where are the mammals? Because I'm willing to bet too that if you listed animals in your head, the majority of them would be mammals. Mammals are the smallest group of our vertebrates. They are a really unique group. They are very far dispersed. They are able to live everywhere, freshwater, saltwater, deserts, Arctic environment. We find mammals literally everywhere. However, they're not the most diverse group, even though they are diverse in that way. Fish still outnumber us as far as species are concerned. So within mammals, we do have sexual reproduction, and they are all going to have internal fertilization. We have variations on the amniotic egg in class Mammalia. They generally have some sort of internal gestation, except for your monotremes, which are your egg-laying mammals. And mammals are adapted to all environments because they have hair for insulation and mammary glands to produce food for young. Okay, we are not saying fur and milk because technically, there are some frogs that produce a milk-like substance that we call milk. Coconuts produce milk. Plants produce milk. You know, you can get oat milk. It is a kind of milk. So when we are talking about mammals, we are talking about mammary glands. Mammary glands are going to produce a high nutrient-rich content of food for offspring that we call milk, but it's the mammary glands themselves, that particular physical structure, that is what makes something a mammal, along with having hair for insulation. So no more scales, no more feathers. We are seeing hair now. Okay, so let's talk about the three different orders or subsets of classes of mammals. Our first is our monotremes. Okay, monotremata. These guys are very odd. I think there are now 7 species because we rediscovered a thought to be extinct species in Papua New Guinea of an echidna. But this includes your spiny anteaters, also known as echidnas, and your duckbill platypus. These organisms lay eggs and they have a cloaca like birds, so they're kind of an in-between group, but they do have mammary glands and they do produce that milk similar to what we see in our marsupials and placental mammals, and they have hair. So even this spiny anteater, these spines are modified hairs. So if we're looking at the classification of mammals, these guys fulfill that requirement. They do lay eggs, which is odd. And they don't have nipples. The milk is produced directly through their skin along their mammary glands, and the offspring lick it or lap it up. So they're not nursing in the same way that we see with marsupials or placental mammals, but they are still mammals because they have those characteristics. Most of these are found in Australia. I think 6 of the species are found in Australia, and then there is one that is known to be in Papua New Guinea that was named after David Attenborough. So it's David Attenborough's spiny anteater echidna, and it was rediscovered in Papua New Guinea. So it's pretty exciting because I think that one was thought to be extinct for a very long time. We do find that a lot of animals that we think to be extinct are actually just living in inaccessible parts to the world, and with better technology and things, we're able to actually rediscover a lot of these species. So it's really cool, it's really exciting. But this is an old group, very ancient lineage of mammals, very early group, and allow us to understand how we kind of see this evolutionary timeline play out. From the monotremes, we go to the marsupials. So marsupials do have internal gestation, but it is a very short period of internal gestation. The offspring are born in a very immature condition and have to climb into the pouch. So the newborns complete development inside of a female's pouch. So these are your pouched animals. That includes your koalas, your kangaroos, your possums. They're mainly found in Australia again, and once they get into the pouch, they are going to attach to a nipple, and that nipple acts like an umbilical cord. So it is a very long nipple, and it actually is like a feeding tube, and it actually goes down the throat of that offspring that's developing into almost drip feeding into the stomach of that animal. And so then it will remain attached to that nipple in the pouch until it completes its full development, and it will then leave the pouch once it is a more mature individual. This includes, again, all of your Australian marsupials, very common there. We do think that marsupials, based on the fossil record, arose in South America and then moved to Australia through the land bridge before the continents divide. We do see a fossil record of marsupials being in North and South America, but dying out. The only one that survived was the Virginia opossum. And I'm going to just get on my little speaker here for just a minute because I have one more group to talk about. But Virginia possums, your backyard possums, are the coolest group, okay? One, their body temperatures are too low to regularly entertain zoonotic illnesses such as rabies. So they don't really carry rabies. You don't have to worry about that. Two, they eat their body weight in ticks and mosquitoes and other pest insects on a regular basis. And so if you have possums in your backyard, that's fantastic. They're doing really great things for keeping your kids and dogs themselves safe from those pest insects, those disease-carrying insects. They eat poisonous snakes on a regular, or venomous snakes on a regular, without getting hurt. They are all bark and no bite. If a possum starts to hiss and be scared and you keep approaching it and it plays dead, it's literally in a frozen state. It cannot move until that wears off. It's like a chemical trigger in their bodies. And so they will legitimately be frozen in that playing dead state for about 30 minutes. That being said, they have terrible eyesight, and so you can pet possums if they're up eating food on the porch with your feral cats, if you happen to feed a cat. Like, I have a mama cat, she lives on my porch. They're just chill dudes. I've seen people who rescued possums after being hit by a car and will dress them up in baby doll clothes, and the possums do not care. I think they're a really cool group. They don't actually have a prehensile tail that they can hang from. Their tail does curl and can hold things a little bit, but it's not the way that you would see. They have cute little footsies, so their feet are adorable, and they're just a really cool animal. We should just appreciate them more for what they do for the environment and the fact that they're the only marsupials that were able to handle the changing environment that they found themselves in. Plus, they're kind of dumb. They don't know what's going on. The possum that I worked with at the zoo was a female in a cage, and I went out one day in February and the cage was bloody everywhere, and I was like, what is happening? What did she do? She had torn all of her claws, and we were like, okay, well, something startled her. She freaked out. It's fine. She was fine. She got mad because I manhandled her and she was fine. A couple of weeks later, there were a bunch of baby possums poking their heads around her. She had gotten pregnant through the cage by a male possum that was wild. And so baby possums look like Disney characters. And I didn't discover that until I went to open her cage to feed her. And there were 7 little baby possums hanging off of her back looking at me. Absolutely fantastic group. So if you want to experience marsupials that are not in Australia, because Australia is scary, go in your backyard and look for a possum. Okay? And then we have our very last group, the one we're probably most familiar with because these are where we are included in, as well as our dogs and cats and things. These are your placental mammals, and this is going to have these extra embryonic membranes in the body that are maintained, and they become the placenta. They develop within the uterus of the offspring develop within the uterus of the female with that placenta, and so as such, we see a huge array of where these animals can live, well-developed brains, very unique diversity within feeding classifications. The internal temperature is constant in these guys, and we often distinguish them by their methods of obtaining food and locomotion. So if you were a predator as compared to a prey, If you ever see a killer whale or a dolphin give birth in a video, you'll see that they do give birth in water because they are in the water, but they immediately take that baby and push it up to the surface because they do need to breathe air because they are a mammal. Mammals are going to be breathing air with those lungs. This is where we see, your polar bears, your seals, your sea otters, just a whole huge array, as well as humans are included in this. We are adapted to a very active life on land, and animals are going to have a lot of different evolutionary traits that allow them to survive and do well in their own environments, regardless of what group of animals that we're looking at. Placental mammals tend to be really interesting to a lot of people, though, because we are most closely related to them, and so we are most familiar with them. Here is your check your understanding for this particular one. Make sure you can go through those main characteristics of our deuterostome groups, and then make sure you can classify the animals. I really want you to know the key traits for fish, amphibians, reptiles, and mammals. So make sure you know those main ones, and then go back through your invertebrates, your protostomes, and make sure you go through those as well. Your exam is going to be a lot of matching, a lot of comparisons. Think about homologous and analogous traits between the different classes that we've talked about, between animals and plants and fungi and protists, as well as between bacteria and archaea. Fill out your table. Happy studying. Let me know if you have questions. Also, go watch any nature documentary and learn more about these guys. It's wonderful.